everyone, welcome back to Drinkers and Thinkers, Episode 4. My name's Dan, and I'm going to drag you through some insufferable content. I do appreciate you being here. There are lots of ways now to engage with the podcast. If you're enjoying yourself, we have a Facebook page. Woohoo! We have a YouTube, if that's your preferred way of consuming podcast content. We have an email address you can reach me directly at, which is thedrinkersandthinkers@gmail.com, all spelled out, all one word. And finally, we have a Twitter, which is something that's entirely new to me, and we have a website which is under construction, but you can go there and look at very little, but it's there. And the website is drinkersthinkers.com. drinkersthinkers.com. So there are lots of ways to get involved. Subscribe on iTunes, subscribe on Spotify, subscribe on YouTube, and feel free to harass the podcast to your heart's content. Because, numbers are numbers. So this week we have with us Jim Black, who's an attorney here in New York State. We're going to talk about strange Supreme Court foibles in Georgia, and more largely talk about the legality of all these lockdowns in these states. What powers did the governors have? What powers have they just assumed? And where are we going from here? So it's a great conversation with Jim later on. Next week, we have Melanie Dorigo, who is running in New York's 3rd District. She's running in a primary against Tom Suozzi for that Congress seat. And she was a great guest. We talk about her experiences as a first-time candidate, and we talk about some policy stuff, too. It's a great conversation. So check that out next week. Later on, I'm going to announce the winner of our first ever giveaway here on the podcast, which is super exciting, and there'll be more of those in the future. So thanks for tuning in. Tuning in? Do you tune into a podcast? I guess it's a legacy term, right? Well, thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoy the podcast, and I'll see you at the end. All right, so straight into the news, and I'm editing this podcast right now for release in 12 hours, but I couldn't pass this news story up, which sort of just came across my phone. I had to weigh in. Andrew Cuomo has issued an executive order telling businesses that we have the right to turn people away for not wearing a mask. Bitch, we already had that right. That is our right. You didn't give it to us. You want to reiterate that for people? That's helpful. That's great. But an executive order granting us permission? We don't need your permission. And this is so typical of politicians, especially the more arrogant ones. Even when he's doing something good or helpful, this has got to be about him. Give me the right. Oh, God. All right, I'm not going to get stuck on that. We're going to move on because there are bigger things in the news and way more important things right now. Well, I knew this would come up on the news first thing, so this is the George Floyd incident in Minneapolis where a police officer kneeling on his neck caused his death. I mean, this keeps happening. I'm not surprised. This guy was dragged from his car in a separate video. He was dragged from his car. He wasn't armed. He was not armed. He did not take a swing at the police. He was dragged from his car, handcuffed, put on the ground, and then had his neck kneeled on. The police themselves on scene said in their report, quote, "He seemed to be in medical distress," end quote. And yet they persisted. This is another American killed by the police. His crime was that he was suspected of writing a bad check. Now, forging a check at a supermarket has to be the lowest grade misdemeanor. I don't know Minneapolis's particular laws, I have to imagine that is the lowest grade misdemeanor that you could perpetrate. I would be hard-pressed to believe anyone would serve jail time for that. Certainly not be executed. They were more concerned that he would run than they were concerned that he would die. This was a controlled situation. The police officers were in control of the environment. It was a parking lot. No one was going to sneak up on them. There was no other suspect barricaded in the store. The car was empty. There were no unknowns here. This was basically a simple case of suspected shoplifting. And this is the result. You know, this continues to sort of blow a hole in the conservative theory that, well, if you just do what you're told, if you just comply, if you just listen to what if you just go along with, well, this guy was in handcuffs. For what? A bad check? Freddie Gray was sitting in the back of a police van handcuffed. Eric Garner was killed for selling a cigarette. There's so much to unpack here, and also, no solutions. There were other officers there. There's the guy kneeling on his neck, the guy who actually killed him. But there were 3 other officers standing there. Whose side do you think they're going to take here? Now, they were all fired, and rightly so. I hope charges are going to follow. But there are always... It's always more than just one officer. It's not just the one officer that choked Eric Garner to death in New York City. It's the other officers who stood by and watched. One of the things that I've talked about, and I think has a huge bearing on this, putting aside the racial issue for a moment, we can get to that, because that certainly plays a role here. But one of the things that I'm seeing is this militarization of the police. And it's in the, we see the weapons that they're carrying. They're buying, literally they are buying surplus military equipment. And this is a whole thing which I'm not going to get into now, but this sort of procurement process, there's money coming from the federal government in order for police to buy up this used equipment, so there's a whole thing here, and we see it. We see the weapons they're using, these up-armored vehicles, armored APCs. That alone is disturbing, but for me, when I talk about the militarization of the police, it's not so much in the material, but in the mentality. And I think this is our number one most dangerous thing that the police have embraced, is the military mentality. This idea of unit first, this idea that your lives are in the hands of your unit, and their lives are in your hands, and your first loyalty and only loyalty is to them. First of all, this is anathema to the idea of the police. Your loyalty is to us. You're supposed to be serving us, not protecting each other in the face of killing an unarmed black man. But it's this mentality that they're going to war, that they're going to battle every time they go out. I've heard this from the mouths of police officers. This is something they believe in. They wouldn't even deny this. Every time they go out there, it's like going to battle. And of course, you get amped up when you go to battle. And now you're getting armed as if you're going to battle. The problem is, our military is incredibly well trained. They're incredibly well trained and dropped into the most unimaginable situations, the most unpredictable, uncontrolled environments. And somehow, on the strength of that training, they're able to keep destruction to a minimum, to keep casualties on both sides to a minimum, in conditions that are less than ideal. But on the other hand, this isn't Basra we're talking about, it's Minneapolis. You're not going to war G.I. Joe. Calm yourselves. You're not going to battle every time you go out there. This is such a dangerous mentality. And I understand the thought that always prepare for the worst. These are men and women who want to go home to their families. Well, so are the guys whose necks you're kneeling on. You're not going to battle. The vast majority of suspects do not attack police officers. The vast majority of suspects, when caught, do not run. The vast majority of suspects in handcuffs do not flee custody. The vast majority of shoplifting suspects are not armed. The vast majority of suspected forged checks at a supermarket do not have accomplices with them. So I understand trying to prepare for every eventuality, but going into these situations already believing that it's the worst case scenario. Our military has such good training that they are able to exhibit restraint even in those worst case scenarios. And the police can't even exhibit that restraint in a shoplifting case. And that mentality is so dangerous. Also dangerous, while on these comparisons to the military, as these cops play at soldier, is the comparison that the military, as I've stated a few times now, is incredibly well trained. We invest a lot of time and money in the training of the military. The same is not true of the police, who are comparatively poorly trained. And I'm sorry, this is a dirty secret. This varies from obviously city to city, jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but police officers in this country are not getting the most professional education to be police officers. These are largely crash courses. And I think just based on results, you're seeing that training for conflict resolution, for de-escalating conflict, training for, empathy, training for recognizing mental illness, training for just general interactions with the public, non-suspects, non-hostiles, is lacking. Training for shooting is appalling. If you look up the police shooting statistics, and you look at them both in the range and under stress, the results are abysmal. On average, they're not hitting their targets. Look at videos, body cams from the cops or cell phone videos. Look at all the times in those videos you see police not using proper trigger discipline. Sweeping a street or sweeping an apartment building with their finger right inside the trigger guard. That's a fundamental rule of gun safety. Even the military adheres to that in war zones. But the police, many of them don't even know better. Or many of them think they know better. There's no training. There's no oversight. There's no discipline. And there's a trail of bodies in their wake. Because so many of these police departments are not churning out professionals. These are goon squads. Guys who get all amped up when they put the uniform on, when they put the armor on, when they pull their weapon out. We need better screening? Maybe that's part of this. But you're going to have to pay these officers a lot better if you want better candidates. Psychological screenings. Persistent psychological screenings. Not just when they join, but when they've been there for 4 years, 5 years. And some portion of these evaluations has to be made public. And I'm sorry, but, there are many places in our day-to-day life where we give up our rights, implied consent. Things that we send through the mail can be searched. We go to an airport, we're going to be searched if we want to get on an airplane. Well, I want to see these psych evaluations. Or at least if there's an incident, they need to be made public. If an officer is under investigation. We need to see these evaluations, and they need to be constant every year, every other year at worst. This job takes a toll on these officers. And I'm not disputing, I wouldn't want to do this job. I would find anything else in the world to do before I would do this job. It's a frightening job. But I expect that the people that do take it on are more capable than the rest of us at doing it, and doing it well. And that some amount of integrity exists when an officer does wrong. When an officer chokes a suspect to death, kneels on a suspect's neck, shoots his gun when he shouldn't have, barges through a door he shouldn't have, tells a story that's untrue, I'd expect some modicum of integrity from the other officers. Because I'm tired of the bad apple theory. Because it's not the bad apple, it's the whole tree that's holding that apple up. I've heard the bad apple theory from the Catholic Church. Training, discipline, integrity, and accountability. 4 things we are currently lacking. These are Americans being killed. How many laws are unjust and then visited upon always, over and over again, a very specific community of people? These are Americans being killed. And it's not the people on my side of this argument, the people looking for justice and looking for change. It's not us that are playing a race card. It's the police who somehow, without fail, always seem to differentiate their Americans. There are these people, there are those people, and there are those people. We're not just seeing patterns that aren't there. We're seeing reality. These are Americans that are being killed. This man's death does not make me safer. You have not taken a dangerous criminal off the street. The 80% of federal prisoners who are there for non-violent drug offenses are not keeping me safe. This is not a better world to live in because of these enforcements, because of these policies, and because of the methods that the police use to enforce them. And this is the predictable result of that obsession with order and enforcement, with militarization. And it would be in everyone's best interests, not just the people who are dying. It would be in the officers' best interest, everyone's best interests, if the police unions were less concerned with pensions and pay raises and more concerned with their officers' mental states. You want to be paid like a professional, act like a professional, and there's no other profession. A taxi driver does not bounce back from getting into 6 accidents and killing 4 of their passengers. You don't come back from that. And other taxi drivers are not going to step forward and say, other than that, he's a pretty good driver. Think about any other profession where these types of mistakes, willful or not, would be tolerated. Even mistakes that don't result in death, but egregious mistakes that go against the stated purpose of a company. Nowhere would this be tolerated. Nowhere would other workers coalesce around these people. If I'm in a work environment and someone is acting in an unsafe manner, in an unprofessional manner, in a manner that's making people uncomfortable, I'd imagine myself and the other employees probably would want this guy gone. But then again, I guess we're not sitting in the foxhole that is Minneapolis. Look, you want to play soldier, then fucking act like one. Conduct yourself like the men and women of our armed forces, with the discipline and integrity that they exhibit. It's time to up your game. What is this? Andrew Gillum has he resurfaced already? What is this? Oh, it's pictures of the hotel room. I thought we had these pictures. Didn't the police have body cams? This has to be old. This 4 days ago this was posted. I think this journalist was in a meth-induced haze for a few months and only got around to posting this now. Well, obviously not going to spend... Am I going to spend time on this? I'm tempted. Am I gonna kick the man while he's down? Yes, I am. Yes, I am. Yeah, you know what? We're going to stop here. We're going to spend some time here just for a moment because, honestly, and this may sound crazy, but I don't think there's a better... I think this is emblematic of not just the Democratic Party, but our political parties in general. I think Andrew Gillum basically sums the whole state of affairs up. So a little background. Andrew Gillum was... the Democratic candidate for governor of Florida in 2018, and he lost to now Governor DeSantis. And Mr. Gillum was then arrested. Well, I guess he wasn't arrested. He was detained. He was on scene in a hotel room with a friend of his who was dying of a meth overdose in this hotel room. So obviously quite the scandal. I guess this is a tale of, you can look at this as a tale of two states, right? So you've got Georgia and Florida right next to each other, next door neighbors. And Democrats of Georgia ran a woman for governor who also lost. Now, both states, by the way, actively disenfranchise their voters. Well, in Florida, it's more of a passive disenfranchisement, whereas in Georgia, Stacey Abrams really... One could argue she may have actually won that election. There was active voter disenfranchisement going on in that election. There were actual irregularities that possibly did alter the results of that election. Anyway, so Stacey Abrams loses. This is an African-American woman in a state with a lot of African-Americans, and I don't know if you've noticed this, but there are a lot of African-Americans living in the South. And, I know everyone sort of looks at everything very jaded in our world, but the fact that the Democrats here are running for governor, someone who not just looks like that community, but comes from that community, has shared experiences of that community, understands that community, this can only be a good thing for not just African Americans, but all Georgians. So it's a shame she didn't get to take the big seat, and she probably got screwed out of that, but she is a rock star in the party. She has a future here. She'll run for Congress. She'll run for a Senate seat there. She'll run for governor again, and hopefully win one day. For a Georgian Democrat to be that competitive is really very heartening, and it speaks to the person that Stacey Abrams is, and the gravity that she draws people to her. Her charisma. I mean, I don't agree with her and everything, but I'll listen to her talk any day. And, she's even on a short list for vice presidential choice. They won't select her, and nor do I think they should. She's relatively new at all this. But it's a great story, and Democrats in Georgia, I don't know if they vetted her thoroughly or they just put her out there, but they lucked out. They hit it out of the park. Because she's going to be with the party for a long time, and she is now a great ambassador for the party. But then you cross the street, you cross the border into that perennial electoral fuck-up that is Florida, God's waiting room, and you have Andrew Gillum, also candidate for governor, also a Democrat. Now, this is bad for the Democrats. This is bad for the political system. This is also bad for the African-American community. You never want to see this. This is, one step forward in Georgia and 3 steps back in Florida because this guy is a moron, and more to the point, the party didn't realize that somehow. But let's look at what happened here. Now, he was running in an election which was also competitive. DeSantis is a despicable human being. I mean, Gillum was basically running against Trump's foreskin and lost. And that, may have been the end of that election, but it probably was the beginning of Andrew Gillum's wider political career. This is a guy who I think at 23 or 24, he was elected to his first office. So this is someone who's been sort of groomed by the party for these big runs. And I guess no one in the party was paying that much attention. So the story goes, Andrew Gillum, can I call you Andy? I'm going to call you Andy. So Andy apparently was away one weekend. He was at a wedding. And he ended up in a hotel room with a friend of his. There's actually another friend involved in this story, and we're going to get to him later. But let's focus on the first friend now. He's in the hotel room with this friend. The police are called. The friend is basically choking on his own vomit. There's meth all over the floor. And Andy is throwing up in the bathroom. Andy was the police used the word intoxicated. I'm not going to do that. Andy claims he only drank, he never used drugs. I'm dubious of that claim because of, the meth all over the floor. So I'm going to call bullshit. We're going to say he was impaired. He was too impaired at that time to even give a statement to the police. So they sent him home to dry out. Now, first of all, they sent him home because he's Andrew Gillum. If that were any other average black man, he'd be in jail right now. So we'll put that aside. That's a whole other thing. But remember that. Any other black man would have been in jail right now. So Andy goes home, tells his rather thin story that he was at a wedding and he made a mistake and drank too much, and that's that. And we don't get any substantive read into this story. Then conservative news outlets started reporting, less than reputable news outlets, I might add, started reporting that the friend, and I'm doing air quotes now, in the room with him was actually a male escort. Now, this at the time sounded ridiculous to me, and I was like, oh, well, here go the conspiracy nuts on the right again. That this was another, one of these nonsense clickbait stories. Well, as it turns out, with just a little bit of poking around, so to speak, one would discover that this guy actually was a male escort. He had a website and everything, and a fake name on the website. The guy was a hooker. So here is Andy frolicking around for the weekend. The hooker was not, by the way, at the wedding. And they're in a hotel room together. And then the hooker overdoses. This all happens, I think this was late afternoon. So it was like 6:30 in the afternoon when the police showed up. I'm not sure about that. I hope that's not the case because, I don't know, if you and your hooker are basically tapping out by 6:30 in the afternoon, Andy, you're doing it wrong. I mean, let that last into the night, man. You're paying for it after all. But anyway, so the police show up. This all goes to shit. And, here's where the third friend comes in. If you're Andrew Gillum and you're living a life of public service, and you're also having a rendezvous with, a hooker, you might not want to get a hotel room in your own name. Which, as it happens, he didn't, because his third friend, his actual friend, like a real-life friend, had the hotel room in his name. The only problem is that friend was not actually in the hotel room. So it was just Andy and the escort. But the third friend is the one who actually called 911. What that tells me, if I'm extrapolating, and forgive me, but I have to extrapolate information because Andy is not being forthcoming. Andy didn't really talk about this at all, or describe what happened at all. So what it seems like is Andy realized that his hooker was dying and called his friend to fix the mess. His friend who got the hotel room for him. The friend said, oh my God, I'm calling the police, and rushed over there. That's what it seems is likely to happen. Now, let's full stop right there. A person in a hotel room possibly engaging in sexual escapades. Did I say escapades? I meant to say escapades, of course. And recreational drug use. Now, from my point of view and my belief system, neither of those two things are any reason to leer into someone's personal life. Who you choose to do what with, whether it's same sex, different sex, even a farm animal. No, that's probably not okay. Let's stick with the first two. I instantly regretted saying that. What Andrew Gillum or anybody chooses to do in a hotel room and with whom, even if there's money involved, because that's more awful legislation, is none of my business. And also, it shouldn't be a point of criticism. And drug use, by and large, I believe, should be none of my business either. What we do in our own homes is our own business. And there should be limits and exceptions to that, but not many. So recreational drug use, I have no problem with that. Marijuana, cocaine, acid, mushrooms, leave people be. And this is certainly not a reason to judge poor Andy who screwed up a little here. But Andy is not just a regular guy, and herein lies the problem. Andy is a public figure. Therefore, this is fair game, because Andy has a family. So the fact that he was with this escort, to me, shows an unbelievable lack of character. The fact that he's not forthcoming or open in any way about what happened that night is a lack of honesty. To me, a politician, even if he didn't use the drugs, being around the drugs shows a remarkable lack of judgment. To be clear, the Democratic candidate for governor from 2018 is in a hotel room with a half-dead hooker and meth. Or, as Rob Ford calls it, Tuesday. But in all seriousness, this shows a remarkable lack of character and judgment and integrity, and it is fair game because this person put himself out there. He asked for our trust. He asked for our money, donations. When he served as the mayor of Tallahassee, he was living off our dime. Now, everyone's flawed, but you have to be held to a higher standard. There has to be a higher standard here. Because we're paying for this guy's lifestyle. Sacrifice has to be made when you're holding office. Even Donald Trump understands that. The man hasn't sexually assaulted a woman since he became president. Well, that must take some effort for him. Even Donald Trump gets it. So this is fair game. And Andy can't really speak to this right now. Why? Because he's in rehab. Now, I'm not going to bash rehab. Certainly not. It's an invaluable resource for people who have legitimate difficulties getting through things on their own. And people go in, and most people come out much better on the back end. But I do have a problem with rehab for politicians and celebrities because they use it as a panic button. They use it as an escape hatch because you can't reach them in rehab. You can't ask them questions in rehab. They're gone for a while the dust settles and things, quiet down a little bit. This is like, you remember when you're like growing up and you're playing tag and everyone's running around frantically like, tag, you're it, tag, you're it. Everyone's having fun and indulging in the spirit of the game. But then there's that one goofy looking kid with the cheese doodle stains on his fingers that stays near base the whole time. It would be like a car or a tree, and he'd be like a foot and a half off base the whole time. And if you came within 15 feet of him, he was like, base, that's the kind of kid you just want to, And that's what politicians do with rehab. That's how they treat rehab. Oh, rehab for alcohol. Alcohol? You're in a hotel room. You got a wife and kids. You're in a hotel room with a hooker and crystal meth. And you're in rehab for alcohol? Come on. So, yeah, I am going off on this guy a little bit, but it's just, there's no standard anymore. There's no decency. And you know what? Honestly, there probably never was. We just know more than we used to. But, to me, it's important to kick this guy while he's down. This is like an epic game of political whack-a-mole, where I'm standing there with that big padded mallet in my hand, just waiting for Andrew Gillum to slither out of rehab and pop his head up through that hole, and then boom! The score goes up again. And then, oh, look, there's Anthony Weiner. Boom! Pops his head up, gone. Elliot Spitzer, boom! I don't want to see these guys again. What's his name? Sanford. Was it Sanford? Sanford was the governor of was it South Carolina? Who disappeared for 4 days while in office. Nobody knew where he was. Turns out he fled to Argentina to be with his mistress for a little mini vacation. And that's why it's political whack-a-mole. You keep up the pressure. You say, get out of public life. Because that guy, Sanford, I think that's his name, Sanford came back and ran for Senate. And I think he won. That's why you got to stay on top of this nonsense. It's okay to have character flaws and people grow, but these people don't grow. These people don't evolve because they live the most self-absorbed lives you could possibly live. So, yeah, I'm going to kick these guys while they're down because I want them out of public life. When you live off of the public, when you live off of our largesse, when you live off of our trust and off of our money, we own you. You're supposed to work for us. We own you, every part of you. If you don't like that, you can go away. And little by little, you can reclaim the pieces of your life and become a private citizen. If Andy wants to go work at the Stop and Shop, and I'm not wishing him ill, it could be a prestigious Stop and Shop job, like deli counter or something. If he wants to go do that, power to him. But I swear to God, if I see this guy on CNN being asked serious questions by serious people about serious matters, I'm going to lose it. And you know that's going to happen. So this brings me full circle. What is the issue here? Why was this guy not vetted? Why is the political bench so thin? Both parties. Why is the bench so thin? This guy wasn't vetted? You think that this 38-year-old woke up on a Monday morning and said, well, now I've decided to be a homosexual meth addict? No! You're telling me there were no signs? You're telling me that no one on his staff thought the guy may have had some untoward habits, thought the guy maybe wasn't on the up and up with his family? And by the way, maybe this guy was a master deceiver. Maybe he kept all of these habits on the DL. But then he's a sociopath. And no one picked up on the fact that he might be a sociopath? I mean, Donald Trump is a sociopath. We all know it. It's not a secret. It's just baffling to me. This is a major state. And the opportunity to take this governor's mansion is huge for the Democrats. This is a state that had the Democrats controlled it in 2000, they would have won that election. This state means everything to the 2020 election. You don't think there's going to be some sort of hijinks down there? This drives me nuts. Absolutely nuts. And I don't want to ever hear from this guy again. Ever. Private life, do some good for your community, and shut up. And now the people of Florida are stuck with DeSantis, who's basically Mike Pence without the charisma. All because Democrats couldn't vet their candidate. They couldn't rummage around a little bit and say, wow, look, there's some skeletons in the in this closet. Oh, drives me nuts. So we wrap up the news, and we're moving on. What am I drinking today? What do I have in front of me? Today I have, well, we've switched gears here. I have a Mermaid Pilsner in front of me. Mermaid Pilsner. This is, it comes in a can. It comes from Coney Island Brewing. And this is a pleasant drink for me. I like this when it gets a little warm out. This is a nice, refreshing drink. If you pour it into the glass, as one should, you get a nice little head on the beer. It's bright yellow, gold to bright yellow. It's really light and pleasant. I will say this, to smell it, to just take a whiff, there's nothing special going on here. It's basically stale beer. But when you drink it, it's very bright and it's very smooth, and I like it. You got a lot of the citrusy notes in there that you love to have in a Pilsner. And this is a Pilsner that is unapologetically a Pilsner. It stands apart from the sort of light Pilsners that Americans drink and call beer, like Budweiser and Miller and all this garbage. So this is beer drinking at its finest. This is a nice little drink. I think it only comes in cans. I don't think it comes in bottles. But that's typical for Coney Island Brewing, I believe. So yeah, check it out, Mermaid Pilsner. If you like Pilsners, this is actually might be one of my favorite Pilsners. Outside of some real, small craft or designer stuff, this one foots the bill. Fits the bill? Foots the bill. Foots the bill. Well, it does both, to be honest. No, I guess I footed the bill because I paid for it. So it fits the bill. It fits the bill that I footed. Oh, God. Also drink responsibly. Yep, so that's it. Mermaid Pilsner. Later on, we're going to do our giveaway. But first, we have introductions are in order. We're going to move on to our interview segment. Today with us, I have Jim Black. Jim is a partner at Silverman Acampora, where he serves as their general counsel, and he's the chair of their government compliance division. Jim has been at it for a while. He's an attorney out of New York, and he's been senior staff counsel to Northrop Grumman. He's been vice president, senior counsel, and chief compliance for CA Technologies, general counsel for chief compliance at Overseas Military Sales. He's also a professor. He teaches law at Maurice Dean School of Law, which is on Long Island, where he teaches corporate compliance and ethics. And he has served as a visiting professor at the Naval Postgraduate School, where he teaches classes in government contracts. He's obviously a member of the New York State and Nassau County Bar Associations. New York State Bar, he's on the Committee for Attorney Professionalism. And in the Nassau County Bar, he's on their Ethics Committee and the Board of Directors of Long Island Import-Export. So this is a guy who's been around for a while. He's also a lifelong Republican, which makes him our first Republican guest on the show. So we've ticked that box. We've had a Democrat, we've had a Libertarian, we've had a Republican now. What else? Well, we'll figure that out. So I'm so thrilled that Jim is joining us here today.
Hey, Dan, Jim, good to talk to you. How are you this evening?
I'm doing well, all things considered, in quarantine. Thanks so much for coming on. So I wanted to get your perspective because you're in the legal field, and I'm sure you've seen it all. And these are strange times.
You think you saw it all, and then something else happens, and you realize there's a lot more to say.
Yeah, well, you and I were talking earlier about how there's always been this sentiment of, well, that couldn't happen here. Well, oh, that would never happen here. And we seem to keep moving the bar for that lately.
Yes, we do. Before I do start, I just want to, a standard disclaimer, the views I express this evening are my own. They're not the views of my law firm, the university I teach at, or the boards that I serve on.
Okay. Absolutely, understood.
So yeah, all the things we thought could never happen, and also the places we thought they would happen first also aren't happening. Within which regions of the country people are becoming more willing just to follow executive orders and decrees.
Sure, and the timing of all this seems really bad. In the lead up to a pretty important election.
Agreed.
Yeah. So the first thing I wanted to get into was sort of a very narrow topic, and that is down in Georgia. There was just recently the case Barrow versus Raffensperger in the Georgia Supreme Court. Can you give us a little background on the case?
John Barrow is a former congressman. He was one of the last Democratic congressmen in Georgia a number of years ago, although that has now changed. 2018, they have elected a non-minority Democrat again in the state of Georgia, but he wanted to go on to the Supreme Court. Now, Supreme Court justices technically in Georgia do run for office when their terms expire. However, there is a very odd and unique part of the law that says when a justice resigns before the end of his term or her term, the governor can appoint someone for a period of up to 2 years. And the upcoming election, because it was not for that justice anymore, disappears. So it does look like on face value that Georgia canceled an election and was something weird there. It was weird, but not because they did something untoward. It was weird because Georgia, like many southern states, have these odd, one would argue, slightly anti-democratic statutes. So, in fact, it was interesting that the court said that the lower court got their reasoning wrong, but their result was right, so they sustained it. So effectively what will happen is the Supreme Court justice will resign 2 months ahead of his term, at which point his next term disappears, and the governor will appoint a new judge without election for not 6 years, but 2 years. So on its face, it was weird, but weird for the wrong reasons. And no offense to the people of Georgia who might be listening, but it's certainly to us it looks a little odd. But that's basically the law.
So this is not uncommon in Georgia. Most of these Supreme Court justices have actually been appointed,
right? Because let's face it, at least not initially, and that's very common. I mean, you grew up on Long Island, so you remember all the times you would walk around and you would see return John Doe, because what would happen when it was determined that a town board member or a county legislator or a county executive or the town supervisor was not going to run again, they would retire early. The rest of the board would appoint a successor to run till the next election, and they got to run as an incumbent. So what this does is it gives the judges, just like other incumbents who get appointed, the right to run as an incumbent and have a track record to run on. Now, usually for judges, that's a bad idea because judges never make popular decisions because they're not supposed to. They're supposed to make decisions based on the law, not based on popular opinion. But that's what they're doing. So they're basically consistently kicking cans down the road and hoping that incumbents will have better chances of being reelected or returned, as opposed to having an open ballot, because everyone does go along with the old, the bird in hand a lot of times, especially in judicial races.
Right, and this is a tricky race for them in Georgia, whereas in years past it would have been a foregone conclusion in an election.
Because it was actually very, very funny. You and I talked about this before, that when these things were put in place in the 80s, it was put in place by the Democratic Party, who then overwhelmingly controlled the state of Georgia. In the early 90s, like a lot of states in the South, the state didn't just gradually move, it literally flipped. Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, South Carolina, all literally overnight flipped in both legislatures and congressional delegations. So the same rule is in place, but it now protects the Republicans who have the ability to do that. And as you mentioned, Georgia is considered a close race. It has 2 Senate races because one of their senators resigned because of bad health, Senator Isaacson, and Senator Loeffler has been appointed, and she's had issues. And now there's another congressman who was on the Judiciary Committee, who was Trump's main advocate on the Judiciary Committee, and he's running a primary against her. Plus, they have a very popular Democrat running against her in a year when there's concern, or concern if you're a Republican, joy if you're a Democrat, that the suburban Atlanta populations are going to flip, and they're not going to support Republicans as they always have. So because of that, the last thing you needed was another potential race they were going to have to fight. So they basically kicked the can down the road 2 years and hope that 2022 is a better year for them.
Right. So all in all, obviously nothing illegal was done, nothing scandalous was done here, but doesn't this 1980s law, doesn't it sort of fly in the face? There was some intention in the Georgia Constitution that people would be electing these justices, was there not?
This was give with the right hand, take with the left. Yes, the idea was to have them elected, but now you never know. Sometimes you have unforeseen consequences of decisions, because on the one hand, you don't want to leave a court short members. I mean, you hear the federal judiciary complain about that all the time, when it takes so long to get federal judges appointed. So it makes sense. Now, again, I'm sure it's one of 2 things. Were they thinking nefariously that they were going to do this bait and switch at the end of terms? Or were they more concerned that with a year to go or 2 years to go, a justice resigns, retires, dies, and you don't want to leave a short bench? So I'm not sure whether this was well-intentioned and there was a hook, or was this something that happens a lot in the South, which is there is an attempt to, as we talked about, making sure that whoever is elected with a full majority. Because the races, you could have a number of different people running for this judicial seat.
Right. I guess along these lines, with everyone's alarm is up right now about these elections coming up, and a number of states, in fact, I think it's like 15 or 16 of them, including New York, have either canceled their primaries or tried to sort of rearrange do it. I know some are doing it by mail only now, but New York flat out tried to cancel it.
Well, there was a Republican primary and a Democratic primary due at the end of April, and then they both got moved. And then the Republicans, because Bill Weld, who was the only other Republican running, dropped out of the campaign, and they said, well, there's only one and excuse me, that's not correct. Bill Weld was not eligible for the ballot. New York is one of the most ballot unfriendly states in the country. It's very hard to get on the ballot in New York State, especially in a primary.
Yeah. And when you do, they move the bar again, so you can't be on next time.
They make it very, very difficult. So he did not have enough delegates. They didn't call me because I liked Weld, but they didn't have enough delegates. He was ineligible. So their position was, well, since there was only one eligible person on the ballot, no need to hold a primary, and we're canceling. That passed constitutional muster. What the Democrats turned around and said was, well, everybody dropped out, so they're only on the ballot in name only, so we're not going to hold the primary. And a number of people, including a number of people supporting Andrew Yang and supporting Bernie Sanders, went, wait a minute, hold on.
Yeah, it was Yang that
brought the lawsuit, right? And then Bernie's team came in support. Yes, effectively saying, well, but we want to say. I mean, what Bernie Sanders said when he dropped out was he was still on the ballots, and he asked his supporters to still vote for him in the primaries, so they would have more progressive delegates to affect things like the platform. So the courts actually did rule against the Democrats and said, no, you have to have the primary. And of course, there was, the usual hue and cry, including the governor saying, oh, the courts want to endanger people's lives because they want us to come out and vote. So it's going to be an all mail-in ballot. And see, that one actually bothered me more than Barrow. I mean, Barrow, the answer is, maybe Georgia needs to amend the Constitution again. But this was just an all grab. The Democrats didn't want to, give any more oxygen to anybody other than Joe Biden, and they don't want any more delegates other than the ones who are simply going to support whatever Biden decides to do.
Well, a few things about this jump out at me, though. First of all, I'm consistently baffled as to why the taxpayers, why the courts would even render a ruling here. This is a private organization selecting whomever they're selecting, and yet the taxpayer foots the bill for these elections and has to facilitate them, which is odd to me. But if we look at it, you're not canceling the whole primary, you're canceling the presidential part of it. There are other primaries going on in New York State, and it completely kneecaps those candidates who are trying to run against incumbent Democrats.
Correct. Well, also, again, the establishment Democrats learned their lessons from Joe Crowley.
Joe Crowley.
And it also happened to a congressman up in Massachusetts who represented Boston. It did happen to a congressman this year out in Illinois, Congressman Lipinski, who, I don't feel a lot of, even though I agreed with him, he was one of the last of the truly conservative Democrats, and I agreed with him on some issues. That said, he inherited the seat from Dad, so people still thought they were voting for his father 30 years on. That's very common, by the way. That happened. It's true in Missouri. It's true in a couple places in New Jersey, where the children of members of Congress just run, and people recognize the name. That's how you help yourself with low information voters. Anyway.
I mean, this is a big blow for incumbents, or for people running against incumbents, because you don't have a name on the top of the ticket drawing people out of their homes.
Well, that's very true. However, there's two sides of that too. Is that one, it's reinstated. It's going to be a mail-in ballot sometime in June, and everybody who qualified will be on it. And it'll be interesting because of some of the things that have been happening. Or some of the statements that Vice President Biden has been making, some people might still come out and vote against him. In fact, last week was the Idaho primary, and Bernie Sanders won 44% of the vote.
Yep,
not run as a non-candidate. Yeah.
Right.
By the way, just in case, so our listeners understand, why do people suspend their campaigns instead of back in the old days when they withdrew? Well, it's money, because if you withdraw, then it limits what you can do with your money. If you suspend, it's still you still have an active suspended campaign, and you can use your money however you want.
It's funny how
Except
that
not at
works.
all.
No, not at all. I mean, this is neither here nor there, but I'm more of an advocate of these parties picking the candidates the old school way and just getting a room. I think that would have served the Democrats better here for this election in particular. If on January 21st of 2017 they said this is our guy or gal, and spent 4
Yep.
years pushing that platform
And
that
one would
candidate.
argue it would have served the Republicans in the long term and the country in the long term if the Republicans had done that in 2016.
Well, you wouldn't have had Donald
You
Trump.
might have had John Kasich, you might have had Jeb Bush, you might have had any number of different people, but you would not have had Donald Trump.
Yeah. Well,
Yes.
missed opportunities. All right. Well, we're going to stay in New York now. I want to talk about these executive orders, these shutdowns, the social distancing, all of this sort of emergency powers. Now, there are mechanisms for this in state laws and state constitutions. Obviously, they vary wildly from state to state, but I think many of these are largely untested.
Yeah, they are. I mean,
right?
it's certainly not to this extent. I mean, I did pull, if you look at all of his executive orders, the boilerplate says that in accordance with Section 29A subsection 29A, Section 2B of the New York State executive law, it's called suspension of other laws. And what I won't read the whole thing. What it basically says is, and here's the key parts: subject to the state constitution, the federal constitution, and federal statutes and regulations, the governor may, by executive order, temporarily suspend any statute, local law, ordinance, orders, rules, regulations, or parts thereof, or of any agency during a state of emergency.
Well, let's start then with the first part. What you just said is subject to the U.S. Constitution and the state constitution. Surely we've already trampled all over that yardstick.
Yes, and as what I think will happen is that at some point when the courts are allowed to open, which is another interesting issue, that when the courts are allowed to open, much of this will be litigated. I think the parts that will get litigated is one of the rules. Two of the rules that came out of this was, one, the suspension of the statute of limitations, which again, just as a citizen, I'm like, well, that's great, because if the statute of limitations was coming up on when I was going to be able to bring a lawsuit and I wasn't allowed in the courts, it's only fair that be extended. The part that I think bothers you and I is the fact that instead of passing a law and having a statute that way, it's being done by executive order, may I say executive fiat, royal decree.
Yep. Now, this is that you mentioned the statute of limitations. That's something that has absolutely never happened before. Is that right?
Not that I know of. I mean, there have been situations where they've been like during a major snowstorm, or I think during Sandy, they were extended, but they were extended for a month, a couple of weeks. These things, and that's the other thing. The statute says it's supposed to be, and somewhere in here it talks about 30 days. That no suspension or directive shall be made for a period in excess of 30 days, provided, however, that under reconsideration of all relevant facts, the governor may extend. But he didn't do that. He extended the statute of limitations by 90 days. He's extended the freeze on evictions by well over 90 days already. It's into August or September, which is, again, if you're a small business owner, or you're a homeowner and you're out of work or you're on unemployment, you're going to, sing his praises and get out the palm branches because he saved your house or your business. But did he have the right to do that? I mean, one of the most telling pieces is or analysis of these is actually a movie. I presume you've seen the movie Lincoln with Daniel Day-Lewis. There's a great scene in there where Lincoln's meeting with some of his advisors, and they're talking about the Emancipation Proclamation. There is nobody who thinks that the Emancipation Proclamation was a bad idea. It was a wonderful, artful move done at the right time, and gee, it freed slaves. So nothing wrong with that. However, we have a Constitution, and at that time there was no 13th Amendment. And some of his advisors said, let the Emancipation Proclamation stand. And he said, well, remember, it's only freeing slaves in territories that I don't control. It was in territories that were up in arms against the government. So once everyone's no longer up in arms, what does that mean? Can I free slaves later? And did I have the right to free slaves in states like Maryland and Delaware and Missouri that weren't in rebellion? So, it's an interesting legal theory question that one of the greatest humanitarian moves ever made was potentially unconstitutional.
Well, it seems that we've never. I was talking with a researcher in episode 1 about the pandemic and the spread and the response, but it seems like in every possible way, we never planned for something like this, for something long term, for something deadly, for something confusing. It doesn't seem like there's any mechanism in law or science that we were prepared for something like this.
I think we all thought we were smarter than this. No one believed that in the 21st century there would be a pandemic that we couldn't fight, that there wasn't a cure or an existing medication, or that something would be this widespread. Now, that said, I don't have numbers for things like influenza or other things that, other deadly diseases. And one thing I think that history is going to look at this as either the saving of a population, or in some ways potentially, and I don't mean to poo-poo any of it, but in what ways was this an overextension? Because everyone in the 2020 hindsight of history, we're going to find out was the social distancing enough just to knock out the virus so it stopped spreading? Because it's down to the numbers are, thank God, very low. I think there were 184 deaths in New York State yesterday, which again, as the New York Times said, it's not just a number, it's a person. And those were 184 people that died.
Right. So, but that's down from 1,000
yes,
in a day.
Exactly. So, and now we have to look at other states and see as they've opened, Ohio, Florida, Georgia, Texas, have there been, what's the second wave going to look like? Is there one? We don't know.
Yeah, well, if there is one, let me ask you this. This, like you said, the courts have to reopen before anything. And obviously the courts move slowly. They're going to litigate this slowly. We're going to probably find out that many states overstepped their boundaries, that they were not, again, subject to the Constitution of the United States and the states, that they were way off the mark. But if the courts do that, and then we get a second wave, does that nullify most of the governor's power to combat something that is kind
if
of
there's a
threatening?
second wave, I think what a lot of these governors are going to do is they're going to say to the courts, fine, sue me. There's one of the sadder moments in American history was you're familiar with the Trail of Tears and the Cherokees who were moved out of Georgia. There was actually a lawsuit.
Yeah.
The Cherokee Nation sued in the United States Supreme Court against the U.S. government, telling the government, saying that the government had no right to do this.
Was that when they said it's the Supreme Court made the
yes,
ruling?
But something like President Jackson said, "I wasn't aware Chief Justice Marshall had an army to enforce his decisions." Yes. So I think some people might take a page out of President Jackson and say, you know what? Because Governor Cuomo talks about this all the time. He says his view is, I'm saving lives, and you want to hold me in contempt of court for saving lives? I can live with that. And that's his view. And that, now, I don't know if I agree with that, but that's his view.
Wouldn't that logic extend to a red state banning all abortion?
Um,
If a governor had a firmly held view that it was that it was a life being ended,
yes.
it's a really
Well,
bad
yes, but
precedent, it seems
here's the
like.
difference. By the way, and I liked your logic on that. I think you're right. That is bad precedence. Here's sort of the difference: is that abortions are done by private hospitals and private citizens. So even though if the judge, a governor would say that, the enforcement won't necessarily be against the governor. It'll be against the doctors and the hospitals who are or who are not performing them. To a certain extent. So that's where it would become more interesting. But here, what you basically you'd have is the governor and Trump and Cuomo sort of dance this dance a little bit, but then backed away from it because the governor's got the National Guard, and if the governor says I'm going to shut this place down, and I'm going to put the National Guard on the streets to make sure people stay off the streets, which is what happened in Michigan, in some cases, that then what the president can do? Send in the army and disarm the National Guard so people can get on the streets again? Yikes! Think of that dystopian uh, result.
Well, I think we also never envisioned, petulant children running our government. I mean, there is brinksmanship going on between Trump and Cuomo. I mean, there's brinksmanship between Cuomo
and there's
Blasio.
brinksmanship between Trump and Governor Whitmer. And
Whitmer.
It's basically Cuomo and Whitmer.
Yep.
I mean, it's interesting that everyone thought it was going to be Gavin Newsom in California, but a couple things. California has a much lower rate than they expected, and Washington State, everyone thought it was all going to be in Washington State. Washington State has a much lower rate of infection, so they're kind of doing their thing. Other than Elon Musk at Tesla going, I'm opening my plant. Arrest me if you want to, in violation of the county order. Which begs another question about what's essential and what's not. And essential businesses have been consistently allowed to open. So why am I allowed to buy booze, but I'm not allowed to buy clothes, or I'm not allowed to buy a card, or even yet, as you and I talked about before the broadcast, how come I can buy a Mother's Day card from my mom in CVS, but the card store is closed and I can't buy it there?
Well, it's this idea that a lot of these big stores have done very well here because they sell 90% of the things they sell are non-essential, but they also happen to sell food or medicine, and so they get to open the whole store, which is obviously killing small businesses.
Because you know what? Next time I need a card, I may just go to CVS and not bother heading over to the card store, which is unfortunate. Yeah. And the statistics have shown for years that the real backbone of the economy are smaller, privately owned companies. They employ something like 80% of employees. They generate some very large percentage of tax of corporate taxes, because they don't have the smarter tax lawyers who find ways for the big companies not to pay taxes. So you've got all that going on. So I don't know what this looks like when this is over. I know friends. I'm in my firm. I have clients that are small, medium-sized businesses, and every day they don't know whether they're. It's like one more day. How much longer? How much longer? Because here's the effect too: is okay. I'm a small business owner. All right, I got CARES Act money that allows me to pay my employees until the end of June, but I'm only allowed to use it basically for interest and some leasing stuff. I can't use it to pay mortgage principal. I can't use it. I can use it for utilities, rent, and mortgage interest. Okay.
There's actually it's a little misunderstood. You can actually use the PPP money for whatever you'd like. What happens is if you use it for the purposes it's intended, it's no longer a loan at that point. Then it's just money they've given you. If you use it, a certain percentage of it for other things outside of the intention, then they slap interest on it and you have to pay it back.
See, here's the other interesting piece that you're right, and I've been advising a lot of clients on this. Here's the interesting piece, though. Now the latest rule that came down did appear to say that it was simply going to be non-forgiveness. But when you applied, you as a business owner signed a certification agreeing to what you were going to use it for. So now,
Yes. Yeah.
so let's say worst case, really a bad fact case. Instead of, so I got all my PPP money and I'm supposed to use it for, and I've agreed to use 75% for salary, 25% for these other narrow things. Anything else isn't forgiven. Well, if I just went ahead and said, you know what, I'm refurbishing all my stores. I'm going to paint everything. I'm going to buy new equipment, none of which is contemplated or covered. Then did I sign a false statement? And there was some indication coming from the Treasury that they might prosecute people for filing false statements.
That would be lunatic.
Well, yes, it would be lunatic, except if you get all the really small businesses who got locked out because the bigger small businesses got the money.
Right. Well, yeah, I think, let me clarify what I said. I was saying in the frame of small businesses, that would be crazy to do that. For the big businesses, I think they are using money for purposes it wasn't intended for.
Well, that's why. Look, this was a good intentioned idea, and they needed to roll it out so fast. I remember reading the regs and the statutes the day they came out because immediately, these things were meant for the client base that my firm represents, and people were calling me and going, but people are on unemployment. I'm like, yeah. Technically speaking, what the purpose of this money was to bring people off of unemployment and pay them. But my office is closed. They can't come in. I know. So you're telling me to pay people to sit home? Yes. And the consternation of educated business people over this, and this is too good to be true. I said, I understand, but that's what the statute is saying.
Yeah. In your opinion, with the mess that this is, do you think that the volume of fraud that's going to come from this is negligible, or is it really going to end up being a pretty big deal?
Vis-a-vis unemployment, it won't be that. I don't know. Vis-a-vis everything else, oh my Lord, is there going to be fraud?
Yeah.
Oh my Lord, is there going to be fraud? Everything from, I've had clients approach me that, we know a guy that knows a guy that knows a guy that can get me masks from pick a third world country. They've got fake certifications of the quality of the PPE, and it's I feel like I'm in Monty Python. Run away, run away.
This really is bringing out the best in people, isn't it?
Here's something else that also, in a certain way, it proves the just how smart people can be in capitalism. Everybody needs a mask, right? How many ads have you seen for masks with certain things printed on it? Everything from logos to characters to your favorite anime to your favorite cartoon character to the state to your organization to your a theater group on Long Island that you and I both know very well are selling masks for $10 each with the logo of that theater on it.
Yeah, they got that going real fast.
Yeah, exactly. So those people are going to make. They're going to make a lot of money off of this. Printers are going to make a lot of money off this because all those masks have to be printed.
Yep.
I saw numbers that again, the Targets of the world and Walmart, their online business is up hundreds of percentage points.
Yep. Well, and especially because Amazon dropped the ball for a while.
Yeah, there was an article in the Times yesterday. Yep.
I mean, badly. Yep. Yeah.
Well, again, it was having. I have a friend in Florida who works for Amazon, and he said it's just getting people to come into work and people to wear masks and people to, this, that, and the other, and suddenly, the weight of the economy is on top of an Amazon driver. So again, but. This is the part that's also going to, in the end, when it wrings itself out, the inequity of what happened here. And maybe, somebody had to suffer because somebody had to be told to stay home. and not work.
Well, I heard one of the greatest quotes I heard from a postal employee on the news, and they were saying, "Are you afraid to go to work?" He says, "Yeah, every day." And he said, "There's a joke around the office. Are we essential or are we just sacrificial?" And I think that sums it up for a lot of the people that were saying, oh, they're essential workers. They're there because they have to be, and they have no choice, either because economically they have to keep getting that paycheck, or because they're just locked in these, in this case, civil service jobs. There is no out.
Well, that's the shame of people. You hear, it's anecdotal, but you hear of like people who work in supermarkets, and a lot of young people work in supermarkets. They're terrified. The break rooms are these massive hysterical cry sessions because people are just so afraid of going out there, because people don't understand. Keep your mask on, and keep your gloves on, and so forth.
Yep. So, Jim, when this is all said and done, obviously, we've discussed there's going to be lawsuits galore against Cuomo and the governors to see, how far they really did push the boundary here. But the question I have for you is, what about businesses? Are businesses going to turn around? Are they in a position to turn around and sue the governor for destroying their business?
I have a friend in Virginia who was going to bring a federal lawsuit on behalf of the restaurant industry in a particular area of Virginia, basically saying the shutdown order was in violation of the federal Constitution. And a federal statute called Section 1983. Basically, it says it's the anti-taking statute, that you can't take away a person's property without paying it for it. And he started talking to some of them, and they all went, "No, we're afraid, because even if we win that lawsuit, the level of inspection that's going to come up, they'll find, if they want to shut us down, they'll find a way to shut us down." Because the barber in Michigan that sued and was allowed to stay open, he's not open because they went and did an inspection and they revoked his barber license on a technicality. So he's closed anyway. So there's such a fear. Everyone talks about, and not to get overtly political, but because let me be clear, I'm not a fan of President Trump, but a lot of people say about his authoritarianism and his dictatorial actions. If you look at what some of these state governors are doing, like punishing this barber for suing, and that's why you've got this group of restaurants who are afraid to sue the governor of Virginia. Now, what will happen is the ones who have nothing to lose, the ones that are pushed out of business. I could see actions. I could see a class action.
You think they have grounds?
It's close, because on the one hand, yes, under federal statute, under Section 1983, you're not allowed to take a person's assets including a business, without compensation. So they have the right to be paid for it. On the other hand, state of emergency, and you want to be able to say, listen, in an emergency, we need to be able to do certain things. Because you want to be able to say, like in a snowstorm or a hurricane, tell people close. And if you lose that right, then you open the doors. Now it's going to become, I think this isn't going to turn into, did they, in the first instance, have the right to do it? Did they have the right to do this for 60, 90, 100 days? That's where the question is going to become. And the other thing is going to be sort of, when is the lawsuit, how quickly is the lawsuit brought, and how fresh in everyone's mind is this? There was a case, I forget the name of it now, unfortunately, but there was a Democratic, I think he was a governor or office holder in Indiana, who was what they called a copperhead. They were pro-Southern Democrats in the North. And President Lincoln had him arrested without charge, violation of habeas corpus, and had him thrown in prison for a while. And he sued. And because the case came out in 1866, after the fact, it was determined that the act was unconstitutional. In the 1940s, early 1940s, there was the Korematsu case, which is the case by the Japanese American citizens who sued and said the president has no right to inter us. Because the case was a little faster and it was term decided while the war was still going on and while President Roosevelt was still in power, the court said, yeah, it's not great, but it's okay. Now that case has since been overturned, um, but in the heat, if a lot of these cases are determined in the heat of the moment, um, you may get some bad law out of it because people are going to say, well, we were happy from a personal safety perspective that this happened, and we almost our rights aren't going to matter if we're dead, to quote Governor Cuomo's thought process. But, remember what Benjamin Franklin said: he who forfeits some of his liberty for security deserves neither.
So I think it seems that the governors with their executive actions, and everyone has railed against the things that Trump has unilaterally done, by decree. And when it was Obama's turn in the White House, the Republicans were yelling and screaming to anyone who'd listen about the power grabs that Obama made. So it seems like somebody needs to sit down and start writing law here.
Well,
is this
yes, that's actually, but it's not a law to prevent it. This is really the abandonment of legislatures of doing their jobs. President Obama at one point, when he couldn't get through Congress, his comment was, "I have a phone and I have a pen." And over the years, in fact, the first lecture I give in my course at Hofstra Law School about corporate compliance talks about the power of the growth of executive orders and the growth of the fourth arm of government, which is the administrative arm, the administrative branch. And the courts more and more are saying we're going to give more and more leeway to administrative decisions. Now, if you look at some of the administrative decisions made, say, by the Department of Labor, I'll give you one example that I'd written about at the time when President Obama was in. There was a real feeling in the Labor Department and the Obama administration that there was a great sense of discrimination against women in business on all levels. And one of the things that they put out a ruling on was off hours interaction in education, because what they said that they seemed to have had proof that older sales managers were spending more time on the golf course, at the bar, hanging out with young men and giving them more of that intangible off topic how to be a good salesman, as opposed to doing that with women who, women were given the opportunities on the clock, but they weren't given the same off the clock. So the Department of Labor basically required, and they could only do it for government contractors. That's what they had control over, because to do it for everybody, you needed a statute, was that they had to report off-hour interaction, male versus female, to show that female employees were getting the same face time as males. So I wrote that this is what happens when you can't be involved in the reindeer games. This is basically what it was. They're not allowing Rudolph to play any reindeer games. But that was sort of the level of intrusion that was coming from the Obama administration. Now, again, if it's true, great, and all power to that, because women shouldn't be discriminated against in any way, even indirectly, even off hours. But now, if I'm a small business, I have to go back to my sales guys and say, "Hey, what are you doing with this? What are you doing with that? You know what the answer is going to be? I ain't doing nothing. At the end of the day, I'm going home."
In your view, have we done anything right or productive here in the last 3 months? Has the government done anything right in your estimation, whether New York State or federal? I mean, I feel left out in the cold. But
certain things were necessary for a while. I think maybe they were done inartfully and not with a lot of thought. Okay, look, the stay-at-home orders. They could have been stay-at-home. They didn't have to be orders. They could have been advisories, and people would not have listened to them. That might be of one thing that wouldn't have been quite so dictatorial, I guess, or have done it a little bit more carefully, because what happened was the state came up with a list of, quote, essential businesses, and then you could interpret that. But it was just essential businesses. In other words, okay, so construction is an essential business, right? But now a warehouse or a supplier of, if necessary, construction is to an extent an essential business. So theoretically, you could come in your warehouse and ship out certain things to your essential clients. But who said you weren't going to ship out all your orders? Or, for instance, like accounting firms were considered essential and stayed open. Law firms weren't. We'll save the lawyer jokes for later. But then they said, because we have certain clients that are essential, to that extent we could keep our offices open. So, I mean, I've been working from home for 2.5 months, and I'm getting used to it. But I go in the office once in a while. So when I'm in the office, I'm like, who's going to stop me from working for doing something for a client that's non-essential? No one's watching, I don't think. But so it's sort of interesting. Not that I would do that and put myself on report, but it's still, you're creating these unenforceable, self-enforcing rules, or what's worse is you're creating enforcement by others. There's a little bit of a 1984 thing here going on, where people are ratting out other businesses or ratting out their neighbors. I mean, you hear stories of people calling the police on their neighbors because they're outside talking and don't have masks on. Or, I just looked out the window earlier this afternoon and I saw people walking the neighborhood. They did not have masks on. Now, there was no one around them, so maybe you sort of, when you see someone without a mask, you stay further away. And then the other thing, is a mask and 6 feet? Is that belt and suspenders? I don't know. Other good things. I think the CARES Act and the payroll protection and the EIDL money were all good things. Execution was so rapid that there were some things that were not well thought out. For instance, and hindsight's wonderful, but why on earth were public companies allowed to apply for PPP? That's weird. And again, it was what they realized too quickly was they said that you could simply certify that you believed in good faith that your business was going to be hurt. Well, everyone's business was going to be hurt. I had one client who ended up, for other reasons, returning the money. And yeah, their retail business went down the hole, but their online business went up hundreds of percentages. And they said, we're actually pulling retail people into the warehouse because we have more work than we can deal with. We need another shift. Yeah. So, I think a lot of things were done as well as could be expected. I don't know. Only time will tell whether this extended shutdown really made sense. But, we're going to go back to Governor Cuomo's line of, because a reporter challenged him about business, and he goes, well, fine, it's death. And I think he overstated it, but he said, but this will happen. Okay. Or death. And that was his response to the entire line of questioning, and to that everybody would rather be alive and bankrupt than dead.
Yeah. I think everyone has at least had to actually briefly consider that question in the last 3 months, though.
Yeah, I agree.
In your estimation, who's doing it right? Who's knocked it out of the park? Any countries stand out?
I think, again, hindsight's wonderful. I think Italy did a good job. I know some folks who live there, and yeah, it was rough. It was really a much more rigid shutdown than we had, but it was for a shorter period of time, and now they're opening, and it seems to have worked. It seems that the virus has been wrung out of the system. So I think Italy's done it right, for one. Japan has done it right. Korea has done it right.
Yeah, Japan had a rough start, but now they're in pretty good shape. I mean, their rough start was just a colossally all-time bad decision on a cruise ship, basically.
Yeah.
So.
And look, I think the federal government has done a few things right. Look, part of the problem is not what they do; it's what the president says. If you ever could separate what he says from some of the stuff that they do, you probably most people probably have less complaint. But
Well, we would also have less
oh
anxiety,
yeah,
I think.
yeah.
So as we wrap up, I'm just going to ask you to prognosticate just a little bit for November for House, Senate, and
Oh my
White
lord.
House races.
Oh my
What are your
lord.
thoughts?
Look, I predicted in 2016. I predicted Hillary walking away, and I was wrong. Uh, it. I mean, I think if the election were held right now, I think Biden would win, and I think the Senate would flip because I think whoever wins whichever party wins the presidency is going to win the Senate because in order to win the presidency, they have to win the flip states. I mean, right now there are at least 4 to 6 endangered Republicans. There's Arizona, Colorado, Senator Collins in Maine, and Senator Tillis in North Carolina. Those 4. Iowa and the one Georgia seat also could get into play. Montana could get into play because they've got a very popular former governor running. So if the Democrats run the board, now again, I don't think that the Democrats are going to carry Iowa. I don't think the Democrats are going to carry Montana. I don't think those seats flip. But in order to win the presidency, either Biden or Trump have to win most of the states I just mentioned, and people aren't splitting votes anymore. People are voting straight ballot. So if President Trump loses Arizona, let's say theoretically, the senator probably goes down too. If he wins North Carolina, I think Senator Tillis wins in North Carolina. So there's some of that. I think the Senate is going to be 51-49 or 50-50 in either event. I don't think there's a big move. I think on the House side, I think the Republicans pick up seats, but not enough to take the majority back. I'm predicting the Republicans take back 5 or 7 seats.
Okay. Well, hopefully you'll join us again sometime, and we can look back on this and either think you're a genius or just kind of laugh.
Well, I predicted a week out that Hillary was going to win because I was writing something on my Facebook about these exact predictions. And I said, regardless who wins the White House, and I put a parenthetical, who are we kidding? Hillary's walking away with this. Exactly.
I was on record for a long time saying Trump.
I didn't believe it.
Yeah.
I didn't believe it.
I went back as far as a year because I remember something came up at work. It was an off-the-cuff joke during a show that was supposed to sort of change with the times, and everyone wanted to make the joke about Donald Trump. I said, I don't think it's that. This was during the Republican primary. I said, I don't think it's that funny because he could legitimately win the whole thing. And I stuck to that for the whole year.
I never thought he was going to win. It took me a long time to realize he was going to win the primary, and that just goes to prove because the Democrats learned from that mistake, and the Republicans didn't get behind somebody else fast enough. And by the way, the media didn't help. The media thought he was a joke.
No, they covered him 24/7. They took all
the option now to remove every other legitimate Republican because, frankly, the media wanted Trump to run against Hillary. Because they figured he was a joke, and that would be an easy win for her. Fun fact, had it been anybody other than Trump, how big would a Republican have won against Hillary? If it was somebody who wasn't crazy. Like, I'm a lifelong Republican. Yeah. I didn't vote for Trump. I will not vote for Trump again. But
I know a lot of Republicans that had to do a lot of soul searching.
That doesn't mean I'm going to vote for Biden either. I voted for Libertarian last time. I'll probably vote Libertarian this time. Just because in good conscience I can't vote for either. That was my joke. Vote Libertarian. We don't nominate creepy old men.
That's fair.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned Weld earlier. He was the VP last year.
He was Johnson's. And by the way, both Johnson and Weld were Republicans. Johnson was the Republican governor of New Mexico, and Weld was the Republican governor of Massachusetts. So, by the way, I don't know if you know this, Bill Weld is a descendant of Theodore Roosevelt on his mother's side.
I didn't know that.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Huh. As Trump would say, he's got good blood.
Oh my God. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I know. Lovely.
Well, Jim, thanks so much for coming
It's
on. I
been a
really
great pleasure,
appreciate it.
Dan. Thank you very much for your time.
All right, talk soon. That wraps up the interview. Again, I want to thank Jim Black. Jim is one of the real good guys out there, and look at that. I mean, he's a lifelong Republican with integrity. They're out there. They're out there. They better get out there in November. So we're going to move on. Before we get to our sort of closing segments, we need to do this giveaway. There are 7 entries here. So through the magic of the internet, I'm going to have them randomize and select a winner. And of course, that winner is getting that bottle of Oban that I promised last week. And so once this is all said and done, I'll reach out to them and get them some good alcohol. So here we go. Randomizing now. We have a winner of our first ever giveaway. Ms. Carolina is getting a bottle of Oban Little Bay. I was actually told in an interesting bit of trivia that Oban actually means Little Bay. So it's basically Little Bay, Little Bay. So congratulations to Carolina. I'll reach out to you and get this bottle over to you in a jiffy. So now we're going to move on to our final segment, and then my farewell to you for the episode. Today I want to talk about our economy. More specifically, Jeff Bezos. There's this report out there that he's about to become a trillionaire. Now, this actually doesn't seem to be entirely accurate. He's not a trillionaire. Jeff Bezos, it seems, is worth about $120 billion. But as the reporting goes, it seems he's on track by 2026 to be worth $1 trillion. Now, a lot can happen between now and 2026, but we're going to talk about this briefly, because this goes hand in hand with this idea that's been presented by a number of politicians now of a wealth tax. That is not an income tax, a wealth tax, taxing someone's actual real estate, a certain percentage. Usually it falls around the 4 to 7% range that's being suggested. And that's supposed to pay for specific initiatives like healthcare for everyone, free college education for everyone. So I want to talk about this for just a little bit. There are 2 questions here that need to be answered. One, should trillionaires exist? And really, should billionaires exist? So that's the first question. The second question is, can the wealth tax actually do what these politicians are intending it to do? So, as for the first question, should billionaires and trillionaires exist? I think my definitive answer would be maybe. Maybe. I think philosophically, maybe. It depends on the size and scale of your economy. Now, I want to talk about that for a second. One of the issues we have in our economy is that it is way out of scale. The scale of our economy is incredibly distorted. That is, the thing that is of least value in our economy and the thing that is of most value in our economy are so far apart that they mathematically, economically do not make sense. The numbers, the scale of our economy does not make sense. Let's take Bezos for a moment. Now, in doing some research, we learned that the average American has a net worth of about $680,000. I'll be honest, that number actually surprised me quite a bit. That was higher than I thought, but when you start to break this down, it makes more sense. So, here's the problem right off the bat. You've got Jeff Bezos worth $120 billion, and you've got an average American worth $680,000. The first fallacy here is average. Average is not really a barometer of the health of our economy and the wealth of its people. Average is right in the middle. Here's what I mean. If you take 175,000 people, and 174,999 of them have zero money, zero, a net worth of nothing. If the 175,000 person is Jeff Bezos, then everyone in that sample group is worth $680,000. You see what just happened there? That's problematic. And that starts to get to the heart of this distortion in the scale of our economy. Now, for the purposes of this conversation, I want to define two terms. These terms are usually used interchangeably, but at least for the purposes of this conversation, I'm going to ascribe meaning to each of them very specifically. The two terms are free market and capitalism, which, again, are usually used interchangeably. But I'm going to define free market as an actual free and open market, where we pay for goods and services, and the prices of those goods and services are defined by supply and demand. On the other hand, we have capitalism. Capitalism is the system we exist in right now. This is a planned economy. This is a highly tampered with economy, and somehow manages to be, on the one hand, an overregulated economy, but on the other hand, an economy that's not regulated enough. That is to say, we have lots of regulations, but many of them don't actually do anything useful. So those are the two terms. Free market, which is what I think people have in their head when they talk about free market and when they talk about capitalism. They're usually just using it as a counterpoint to something like communism. But there's some interesting language, because a lot of people will always say, well, socialism isn't communism. They're two very different things. Well, I'm going to assert that free market and capitalism also mean two very different things. Capitalism is a state-imposed, state-planned economy, the one we live in. Free market is something very different and probably a bit more benign. Now, first of all, in both systems, there are always going to be rich people. There are always going to be people who have far more than everyone else. And there will always be poor people. There will always be people who have far less than the average person. This is inevitable in any of these systems. Now, we can discuss the virtues of market systems as opposed to something like, socialism or utopianism or whatever else we can concoct. But if we're going to live in a society that exchanges currency for goods and services, there will always be, forgive me, winners, and there will always be losers. You hope that the winners are the people that work the hardest and have the best ideas, and that the losers are the people that don't. Well, that's not always the case, obviously. But what we don't know, what we've never been able to figure out in our economy, is how many people need to be poor in order to have one rich person. In other words, in order to have a rich person, you have to have poor people. But how many? What is the actual toll a rich person takes on the rest of society? And again, I would argue that the scale of that is way out of balance in our current system. Because I gave the example before of a pool of 175,000 people. Jeff Bezos having money, no one else having money. But again, average doesn't tell the story. So the idea that one Jeff Bezos could replace 300,000 or 400,000 Americans in our economy, that one person is worth more to the economy than 300,000 or 400,000 Americans, is ludicrous. He can't possibly be worth that much. In fact, I would argue that Amazon, which our system values tremendously, if Amazon were gone tomorrow, there would be 2 or 3 other businesses that would easily pick up the slack for Amazon. Amazon would be entirely replaceable. Apple would be entirely replaceable. Microsoft is entirely replaceable. In fact, those last two are replaceable by each other. My point is, in our economy, again, talking about scale, what is the actual value of the company, the actual value of the service, the actual value of the individual in charge? And I can tell you, it's certainly out of balance, that Jeff Bezos is not worth 300,000 Americans. That Apple is not worth, what are they worth? $1.4 trillion. That's a bit ludicrous. So what's driving those prices? What's driving this worship of company, this worship of wealth? Well, we get to the stock market, who is a culprit here. And people are going to say, well, the stock market is driven by consumers. Well, but it's actually not. Now, consumers and quote-unquote average Americans put their money in the stock market, but they do so through gatekeepers. They do so through brokers, brokerage firms, traders. This represents a fraction of a percent of the American consumer. A fraction of a percent. And these are the people that are driving these numbers, that are buying and selling. How can a company lose 30% of its value overnight? You hear about this all the time. Such and such dropped 20 points last night. Well, that doesn't make any economic sense, that a company could be worth $1 billion on a Wednesday and be worth $600 million on a Thursday. And I know that defenders of all of this are going to say, well, that's just the market reacting to consumers, reacting to the thing with the people who buy the product. No, that's not what's happening here. The market is not a tool for consumers to invest in businesses they believe in anymore. It's simply a tool for speculation for a very small slice of people who know how to do these things and know how to manipulate these things. The company is not 40% less valuable when you wake up in the morning. That's ludicrous. Use Boeing as an example. Boeing lost a tremendous amount of its company value because of some of their indiscretions, mostly having to do with killing people. So Boeing loses its stock price, and you say, okay, well, that's a pretty reasonable reaction. But it's not really a reasonable reaction. They lost their stock price. Somehow the value of the company, which should just be predicated on its IPs, its physical assets and its liquid assets, somehow those things lost value. But what didn't happen, and what should have happened, were this a free market, is that those planes, a $250 million aircraft, you should now be able to get 2 of them for that price. I should be able to buy 2 wings and a piece of landing gear out of my pocket at this point. Consumers never got the opportunity to react to this. Now, you're saying the average person doesn't buy planes. That's silly. Yes, but the average person flies them. So when I fly United Airlines, if they put me on a Boeing jet, I should get a discount on that ticket. I should get a steep discount on that ticket. But that didn't happen. None of the normal economic forces that should have occurred did. Only the stock market reacted. And it had no effect whatsoever on the larger economy. That's what I mean when I say it's a highly planned, highly tampered with economy. Also, the price of goods and services, based on supply and demand. But ours are not. They're not. The entire system is predicated on your ability to incur debt. If you buy a house for $500,000, you can't tell me, well, it's worth $500,000 because that's what people are willing to pay for it. Yes, but they're only willing to pay for it because they can access near limitless debt. The price of every important thing in our life, from housing to automobiles to education, is entirely built upon the premise that we're going to incur debt to pay for it. That doesn't seem like free market economics to me. If the average person's take-home pay is this, then they should be able to afford a house for their pay times however many months, however many years, something reasonably attainable. That's not the case. And certainly, we who go to work for a living, and the people who are getting paid wages for a living, their companies are not incurring debt to pay them an overinflated wage, but they're expected to purchase a house at an overinflated price, all predicated on an industry of debt. If you eliminate that industry, which is artificial, then 99.9% of people living in America could not afford the house at the prices they're currently offered at. Which is fine, because then that would be reflective of the wages they're being paid. Then that would be reflective of the price of milk and the price of gasoline. It would fall in line with the price of clothing. But right now it doesn't. Our economy's scale is distorted. It is tampered with. So as it currently stands, no, there shouldn't be billionaires and trillionaires. It's out of balance. It doesn't mathematically make sense. So that's the first question. The second question, will the wealth tax do what they say it's going to do? Because here's the thing. I am not an advocate of tax and spend at all. I recognize that the government needs to collect taxes to perform essential services. I even advocate the government performing more than just essential services. I believe the government should be a safety net for all of us. They should be our backstop. I'm not entirely opposed to the idea of government health care. What I am opposed to is our current system, where the money is taken in great amounts and is wasted. We get no return on our investment for our taxes. $2.6 trillion a year they collect, they spend for, and we have very little to show for it. So if you're telling me that we can institute a tax that will specifically pay for this thing, I kind of like that idea. Money that's earmarked for specific things and simple things, things that are easy to understand, things that perhaps don't get lost in a bureaucratic nightmare. Well, that would make a lot of sense. But can a wealth tax do that? Well, no, it can't. This is a fallacy. So given that it can't do what they claim it will do, given that after 10 or 15 years of a universal healthcare system or a universal college education system, we'll then have to find some other way to pay for those systems, which we don't have and we can't conceive of. And that's just a criminal lack of forethought and foresight. And the people who advocate this wealth tax that's going to lead us to the promised land, either lack an understanding of the economics of this, or they are willfully lying to us. So where does the wealth tax fail? Well, it's very simple. In the interest of using nice round numbers, I'm going to say that, let's say we're going to tax a pool of people who have a total wealth of $1 trillion. Again, I'm making these numbers up just to illustrate the point. And let's say, for the sake of argument, that the wealth tax will be 10% on estates over $1 billion. So the pool that we're drawing from is $1 trillion of wealth, and every year we're going to tax 10% of people's estates. Disclaimer right now, 10% is much higher than what's being proposed, but hang in there with me. So, year one, we have health care for everyone. We have college for everyone, because when you tax $1 trillion at 10%, you get $100 billion. Well, that's a lot of money. Well, that's an awful lot of money. So with that $100 billion, we're paying for all these wonderful things. So here's where the wheels come off a bit. Nobody makes $5 billion in a year. Nobody makes $2 billion in a year, except in extraordinary circumstances. To be ultra wealthy means you're pulling in, maybe a few $100 million a year, which is obscene and impressive. My point is, nobody in that top tier of billionaires / trillionaire is making enough money to cover what you're taking every year in the wealth tax. So just to do this in a sterile fashion, $1 trillion has been taxed 10%. So the government ends up with $100 billion in year one. Next year, when they go to take that money, that 10%, they find that there's only $90 billion to pay for free education and free healthcare, because you've already taken 10% of the wealth. And again, and you can look this up, but people are not making billions upon billions of dollars a year to replenish this war chest. In 5 years, you're down to about $60 billion. in 20 years, if you achieve the stated purpose of the same people who are arguing we should do this to pay for our long-term health care, the stated purpose there is also to eliminate billionaires. If you do that, you have lost your source of funding for your programs. I'm not missing anything here. You cannot say that we're going to institute a system of national health care and free college education for everyone, and we're paying for it with a wealth tax, and then in the same breath say we need to eliminate billionaires. If you eliminate billionaires, you're eliminating your wealth tax. You're eliminating the pool from which you're drawing money for all of these things from. What happens then? In 15 years, forget 15 years, in about 5 years, when we can no longer cover the costs, because the costs of healthcare and the costs of education are going to go up every year. They're not going to go down in parallel with the wealth tax. They're going to go up every year because the cost of everything goes up every year. What is the plan beyond year 5? It is so unbelievably intellectually disingenuous to put forth this plan and to say we're going to use this money for this and we're going to eliminate billionaires. You can't do both. It doesn't work. What's the plan beyond year 5, beyond year 10? It's a ludicrous idea. Now look, in our current society, I've said this, should billionaires and trillionaires exist? No, it's out of balance. If you want to wealth tax these people out of existence, we can talk about that. That's a long debate, I suppose. What would make sense then is to use that money for a purpose you actually can achieve. How about infrastructure? How about infrastructure? A one-time expenditure. You get 5 or 6 good years of this billionaire money, you could build a lot of roads. You could build a lot of solar farms. You can build a new electrical grid, which we desperately need. I always laugh at the people who are arguing over energy. It should be green. It should be green. Or you got the people on the other side who want coal and nuclear. What they don't realize is our electrical grid, the system by which we deliver the electricity, is 100 years old. So unless we fix that, it doesn't really matter where we're getting our power from. Let's invest in that. Let's invest in high-speed rail. Let's fix the air traffic control nightmare that we have in this country. Let's use that money for something that it can actually do. And I know infrastructure is not sexy. And I know it doesn't, in theory, doesn't save the American taxpayer any money like healthcare would. But these folks are going to be awfully sorry after year 6 or year 7. That money's going to dry up. We're going to have to come up with it somewhere. You can't take their health care away at that point. I suppose you could, but it seems unlikely. When we become entrenched in this system, there's no way out. There's no way out. And the countries that do have national health care systems, and I'm not saying they're all bad. There are countries that do this well. I don't think we're capable of doing it well, but there are countries that do this well. But there are also countries that have gotten into trouble. And the one thing that we should learn from those countries is once it gets into trouble, there's no way out. You cannot change your mind and switch back to some other system. So if you're doing this, it needs to be paid for in perpetuity. And the wealth tax doesn't do that. And it is so intellectually disingenuous to suggest that it would. And again, I'm not opposed to it. Use that money for purposes that are achievable, that are helpful but achievable. Now, government waste and government spending, that's a topic for another time. So we're going to leave it right there. So I thank you so much for giving me some of your time to listen to my rants and my raves, and I hope you'll join us again next week when we have Ms. Melanie DiRigo on the show, who's running for Congress in New York's 3rd District. I want to remind you to find us on Facebook, find us on Twitter, check out our website, drinkersthinkers.com, email me at thedrinkersandthinkers@gmail.com. Yeah, that wasn't that well thought out, I suppose. But engage with the show. A few of you have already, and that's pretty exciting. Also, a reminder, you can find us on YouTube where you can like and subscribe, and then you'll never miss an episode of this interminable vanity exercise. So thank you so much, and I hope to see you guys next week. Please remember, think first, drink later. I'll see y'all next week.